Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Professor John Dewar, and I'm the Vice-Chancellor of La Trobe University. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet this evening and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I am absolutely delighted to be here to open tonight's Ideas and Society event. This series, Ideas and Society, under the leadership of our incomparable Vice-Chancellor's Fellow, Professor Robert Mann, continues to be one of the most thought-provoking and, we think, important forums that we have for the discussion of ideas. Indeed, we believe there's nothing quite like it anywhere else in Australia. That's partly because Rob continually puts together incredibly knowledgeable and engaging speakers to talk about the topics we all care about. Recently, the Ideas and Society series has heard from Tim Costello and Connie Lenenberg on Australia's international obligations. Events later this year will feature Noel Pearson on Indigenous constitutional recognition, Kevin Rudd and Terry Moran on governance, Tim Flannery on climate change, and Jane Caro and Anne Mann on gender equality, and Cassandra Goldie and Frank Brennan on social justice. We're always richer for hearing the discussion and reflecting on the ideas that these sessions generate. And I'm delighted to say that tonight's event is no exception. As part of the Ideas and Society A Better Australia series, our two discussants this evening will be talking about something that lies at the very heart of civil society, protecting and promoting human rights. And this is an issue that, if anything, is more important now than it has almost ever been, because we have countless examples here on our own doorstep of human rights being under threat. We know that prejudice and discrimination continue disproportionately to affect Indigenous Australians and women. We're all too familiar with our nation's treatment of asylum seekers and the rise of the kind of anti-Islamic extremism that we've seen recently on the streets of Bendigo. Efforts to water down racial vilification laws and anti-terror laws that reach ever more deeply into our daily lives. But while this situation sounds gloomy, we're fortunate that there are people who spend their lives trying to bring justice to bear on these issues. And tonight we'll hear from two people who've done much more than most in this sphere. First of all, Gillian Triggs is a distinguished international lawyer and the former president of the Australian Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission. She has combined work in commercial legal practice with an academic career and has held positions including Dean of the Faculty of Law at the University of Sydney and Director of the British Institute of International and Comparative Law. She is the new chair of Justice Connect, a non-profit organisation that connects people locked out of the justice system with free legal help and continues to be a champion for social justice. Only a fortnight ago, she was in Canberra to call for an Australian Bill of Rights in an address hosted by Amnesty International Australia and the ANU College of Law. Julian Burnside is a barrister based here in Melbourne. He's well known as one of the nation's most passionate and eloquent advocates for asylum seekers, and he has worked pro bono on countless asylum seeker cases. He's a former president of Liberty Victoria and has received numerous awards in recognition of his advocacy for asylum seekers, including the Sydney Peace Prize, which he was awarded in 2014. He's also been made an Officer of the Order of Australia, and in 2004 was elected as a living national treasure. And we are delighted that he's joined us tonight to talk about an issue which he knows so well. Now, the format for this evening is that Gillian and Julian will talk for about 60 minutes, and then we'll have time for some Q&A for about half an hour with the audience, and we're aiming to finish at about 8 o'clock. So for now, I will leave you in their very capable hands to discuss how human rights can be extended and defended. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Gillian Triggs and Julian Burnside. Thank you.
It's always lovely to sit down and chat to you. And I was wondering what we should start with tonight. We started actually on chamber music, but that's probably not what people are here to listen to. But John just gave me the idea. Thinking about Indigenous rights. It's difficult to go to any public event in this country without hearing someone say that we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we meet on, their elders past, present and emerging. Why don't we also acknowledge that our forebears took the land from them and we're not giving it back?
Why do we not acknowledge it? Because I think that Australians have a lot of trouble recognising this and saying it. There has to be some explanation for why the government has rejected so ignominiously the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I find it quite extraordinary that this considered proposal that was developed over many, many months in consultation should have been dismissed in the way that it has been, with, I think, a joint parliamentary committee now to look at it. I think that failure of leadership does filter through society as a whole. I think we have a lot of trouble as Australians recognising what we did when we came to Australia. I'm a 10-pound pommy migrant. I'm many years after the original act, but nonetheless, I'm very conscious of it, and I think we can't deal with it.
John Howard's explanation for it back then was that wasn't us. That wasn't our generation. And yet, he hoisted Anzac Day celebrations to a new level. And that wasn't us either. That was our great-grandparents, if anyone.
That's right. Yes, they're clever, slick arguments that really don't have any substance. But we'll probably come back to this, but a recurring theme for me is the failure of leadership on these issues. And I think when you don't have leadership, then that tends to license people throughout the community to take the same view. And I think too many of us have allowed that thinking to become pervasive, partly driven, I think, by a fear that we're going to have to compensate or that we'll lose something. And I think that's, so much modern politics is driven by fear in one way or another.
Yeah, the fear that we might lose our land, but we've made it very clear we're not giving it back. I actually had an idea a little while ago that I think Aborigines are now about 2.8% of the population. I had an idea that all the land that we took from them, which we're not giving back, you could put a once-off capital tax of 2.8% on it and hypothecate that money specifically for Aboriginal communities. Of course, not surprisingly, Gerard Henderson got stuck into me saying what a ludicrous idea it was and how I wasn't going to give back my home and all that sort of thing. But I think it might work.
Well, I don't really think it's about the money. There are quite significant sums of money put into Indigenous programs of one kind or another, and native title has moved, of course, with a snail's pace, but we now have the states engaging in treaty relations with Indigenous peoples, again, not led at the federal level, but coming from the states, state governments, particularly in Victoria and Western Australia. It's not really been about the money, it's really been the core difficulty, I think, and this is reflected all the time in my discussions throughout Australia with Indigenous peoples, is the failure to consult with them. So that when you impose a policy, whatever it is and how whether it's in good faith, and it usually is in good faith, it will not work if you haven't engaged the local community, and that's particularly the drug and alcohol areas, the basics welfare card. They work in communities that have been engaged in the process of agreeing on the proposals, but they don't work where there's not been consultation. And I think that's if we could consult in a way that respected that slightly less than 3% Indigenous population, I think we'd move a lot further forward.
Yeah, and yet consulting may involve acknowledging that there are other positions which we don't like to acknowledge.
No, well, but that is a logical conclusion of consulting with somebody. So it creates a problem for government, and the government is deeply fearful of the need for some massive form of compensation or loss of what we've gained.
To what extent do you think our approach to the Indigenous population reflects the attitudes of society at large, and to what extent does it just reflect the attitudes of people in government?
Well, I guess it's not one or the other necessarily, but I'm inclined, after particularly my last 5 years with the Human Rights Commission, to say that so much of this is led by government. Most Australians never deal with Indigenous peoples at all. They have very little contact with them. And I'd have to say, to my shame, that when I took over the role as president of the Australian Human Rights Commission, I had never worked directly with an Indigenous lawyer. I'd had Indigenous students in the law school at Sydney when I was dean, but I had never worked professionally on an equal basis with an Indigenous lawyer. And I knew very little about, apart from the legal aspects concerning Indigenous issues, I knew very little about how their communities work, what their problems were, and what I didn't understand, but I now have a better sense of, is the wisdom and spirituality that they bring. The richness that we lose by ignoring them as part of our own culture is breathtaking. But it has to be learned, and I think because most of us don't ever connect with Indigenous peoples, certainly not in the rural and remote areas, I think we've got very little empathetic sense of what their problems are.
It's funny, I've sometimes thought that the only bright spot in this area comes from Tony Abbott, who, of course, is a fearless campaigner against the idea of climate change. If he turns out to be wrong, as I think he will, we're all history. There'll be a few survivors, the Kalahari Bushmen, outback Aborigines. So it may be that Tony Abbott leads to the Aborigines getting their land back.
Well, I hope it's not apocalyptic in that way. But you do remind me of, and I forget that it was about 5 years ago, I happened to be in Parliament House when that remarkable piece of legislation was passed, Julia Gillard as Prime Minister and Tony Abbott as Leader of the Opposition, when they passed the legislation that set in process the consultation that led to the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And that was a remarkable day. I mean, politicians from all sides of politics were roaming the marble corridors up there in Canberra, congratulating themselves on this remarkable legislation, and a tragedy that it should fall apart in the way that it has. But that was an optimistic moment in the past that perhaps I think we should strive to get back to.
Of course, it would be difficult for you to be optimistic about the political process, given what happened to you as chair of the Human Rights Commission. This was start of 2012, I think, wasn't it?
That's right.
You were reporting on what was going on in Nauru and the terrible damage being done to children there, and then they brought up John Bassik.
That's right.
Yes, remind people of John Bassik's case.
Well, I was completely surprised by this because it seemed so obvious to me. But the Bassik case was a man from Papua who had come to Australia as a political refugee, and he was acknowledged to be a refugee. In those days, Australia was acknowledging that there was a right to claim asylum, and he was duly recognised as a refugee in all the circumstances. However, he had some cognitive intellectual disabilities. He was a violent man. He had a partner. He became very violent, and he killed her, particularly nastily, with a wheel of a bicycle. It was a nasty killing. He was charged with manslaughter and convicted, and he served the full period of his prison sentence of 8 years without parole being permitted. He got to the end of the 8 years, and he was immediately rearrested because he couldn't be held in a maximum security prison anymore. He was arrested again and held again in a maximum security facility for, by now, another 11 years.
And this is because his visa had been cancelled on character grounds.
Well, they didn't. That wasn't the term at the time. But that's pretty much what they did. They simply said they couldn't send him back. They acknowledged they couldn't send him back to Papua, and the minister and respective ministers across governments have said they would not release him because he was dangerous. Now, the key point goes back to the Magna Carta. In the middle of this extraordinary document of 1215 is a provision that no man may be detained arbitrarily without charge or trial by his peers. This is not a left-wing imagination of the General Assembly since 1945. This is a core principle.
I thought King John was a rabid left-winger.
his feudal barons, I think, formed that role. But the key point is that this principle that no person may be detained without charge or trial by their peers is fundamental to at least our common law system, and in fact common to just about any other major legal system. We, however, because of the concept of executive power, which worries me greatly in Australia, the expansion of executive power, the government and ministers decided that they would hold him in a maximum security prison indefinitely, and he's been there indefinitely. It would now be about 13 years. Now, my point is, he came to the Commission with a complaint. I reviewed the complaint as president, and that was my job, and I found that to detain him without charge or trial and to detain him in a maximum security prison without the medical care and support that he needed was, or constituted, arbitrary detention. And that he should therefore be removed from maximum detention, put into hospital detention of some kind, but certainly given the treatment that he needed, or given another charge and tried before a judge and jury and prosecuted in the normal way. Well, I reported, as I reported probably 20 times a year on cases, egregious cases of this kind, including the detention, of course, of children on Nauru and Manus at that time and other parts of Australia. But like so many of those reports, they must be tabled in Parliament by the Attorney-General. But the Attorney-General would table the reports with the words, "I table this report." So there was no name, no context, nothing that would tell the public or parliamentarians what these reports were about. And many of them, if not most of them, sank like a stone. So it was with complete surprise that at one of the many Senate estimates that I attended over the 5 years, some of the senators chose to pick up the Bassik case. And they said that I was, in effect, wanting to release dangerous, violent men who killed their partners in the most violent of ways. I wanted to release them onto the streets, and that I should be ashamed of myself, and I'd got it wrong, and I should resign. So this went on over several Senate estimates, simply attacking on a ground that they felt they could get public sympathy for, where they really ignored the core point that I was trying to make, that there is a right to some proper judicial process that limits executive discretion to detain.
Yeah. And that's what made me think again recently of against the Secretary of State, a decision of the House of Lords in London. The English Parliament had passed legislation which said that if a person was a refugee, so they can't be removed from the country, and a suspected terrorist, although they haven't been charged or convicted, that person could be put in detention for up to 12 months. And that was said to be to preserve the life of the nation, which is a sort of get-out clause in the Human Rights Act, because this was absolutely incompatible with the English Human Rights Act. But it would have been okay if it was to preserve the life of the nation. So the question ends up in the House of Lords, is this valid legislation or not? 8-1, they said, no, it's not. And Lord Hoffmann finished his speech saying that the life of the nation is less threatened by terrorism than by laws like these. Very powerful idea.
It was.
I was really impressed when I read that. If only we could get someone in this country saying that.
Well, that's true, and that comes back to the point about leadership. In that case, of course, a very highly regarded judge of the then House of Lords. But the point also needs to be made that Lord Hoffmann had a Human Rights Act. He had a power to say to detain indefinitely at the whim of the executive is contrary to the Human Rights Act.
And that's why preserving the life of the nation was an important get-out, because if they could establish that, then they could legislate in a way that was incompatible.
But the key point of difference is that we don't have a Charter or Bill of Rights or Human Rights Act in Australia. In talking about this in Victoria doesn't have quite the same impact as it might in other parts of Australia, because, of course, you're the only state that has a human rights charter. So the thinking of Victorians is much more likely to be informed by that fundamental charter. But, of course, at the federal level, we don't have that, unlike, of course, the United Kingdom.
Of course, the Victorian Human Rights Act is a very weak model and has generated very little litigation and no significant legal fees for any lawyers. So the idea of a lawyer's feast is false. The idea of a sudden tidal wave of litigation is false. I don't know what the politicians are scared about.
Well, of course, the argument that many politicians make, particularly Bob Carr from New South Wales, has done more to damage the prospects of a Bill of Rights or Charter of Rights in Australia than anybody, I think. And the argument he makes over and over again is not only lawyers making money, which is clearly false, but that judges will suddenly go from being conservative, trained, educated lawyers to left-wing activists inventing the law as they go along. And it is interesting that in Victoria, with the Charter of Rights, only 1.6% of cases by the Supreme Court has ever even mentioned the Charter of Human Rights. It just has not been a vehicle for rampant judicial creativity that is being alleged by many of our politicians. But at the same time, I wouldn't want anybody to think that it's therefore ineffective. It is weak, you're right, Julian, but it's a great deal better than anything else we've got. And I think it's probably a model that we could learn, at least as a foundation stone, to move to the next stage. But the key point, and the reason it's so important in Victoria, is that, of course, it informs the decisions of decision makers, of government officials. And that is where you have the impact of a Bill of Rights seeping through the administrative daily lives of citizens in a much more effective way than if it wasn't there. And a very recent example, in fact, I think only a couple of months ago, the Victorian Supreme Court ruled on the basis of the Charter in Victoria that juveniles should not be held in adult prison facilities. And you might recall they've been moved now from the Barwon Heads facility back up to Parkville. Difficult circumstances, I do understand that, but nonetheless, the reason that was able to be clearly stated by the Victorian Supreme Court was that you have a charter here. And at the Human Rights Commission, we tried to bring juveniles in adult facilities in Western Australia into proper juvenile facilities, but failed, and one very good reason was there was no charter.
Just going back to the Bassick case and the attack that
I
provoked.
thought we might have got away for that one. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting. For the whole of that attack, a great deal of which concentrated on what you'd said about the cruel consequences of locking kids up on Nauru. The report which you'd delivered and which had been tabled by statutory obligation, spoke about how bad things were in Nauru, and the government didn't like that, so they had to counterattack. And all the while, I discovered a little while later, they tabled the report by Philip Moss.
That's right.
Which agreed wholly with what you had said, but they didn't have to table it. They had it in their back pocket for the whole time of the attacks on you.
That's
It was
right.
astounding. They were prepared to mislead the whole country in order to make a point against you.
That's right. I think I was also really unprepared for that because, I'd been a relatively conservative lawyer, only occasionally in the media and an area of expertise, but otherwise not. And I thought, somewhat naively, I think, thought that if we did our homework on the facts, worked with a medical profession on the condition of the children, we knew the law. It was not difficult law. They were detaining children and their families for unprecedented periods of time. Surely the conclusions of the report that the conditions were cruel and dangerous, inhumane and contrary to international law and contrary to the treaties that Australia has accepted and of course contrary to the underpinning definition of human rights in the Charter, I thought that will be treated with respect. And if there was anything wrong with that report, if we got our facts wrong or we got the law wrong or we made an immeasured judgment, an immodest judgment, or in some way we targeted one party rather than another, they might have been able to properly criticise. But that's not what they did. They didn't do that. They criticised me personally. And that I really was not prepared for. I couldn't see why they would bother with me when the facts were in front of them. And that's a lesson I learned.
They never challenged the facts. They never challenged the facts.
They never challenged the fact. And of course, one reason they couldn't challenge the facts was that so many of the medical facts of the impact of the prolonged detention on the children were in fact departmental official figures from the health and medical services that were provided. So although we had our own material, they were mirrored exactly. The 34% mental illness of children, for example, at the moderate or senior level was a departmental figure. So I guess they must have said, well, we can't attack this report,
Yes.
but we don't like it,
Yeah.
so we'll attack Gillian.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there was a measure of success in that picked up, of course, by the Murdoch press. The other press largely left it alone. I now have at least 40 mainly funny but sometimes quite cruel cartoons to explain to my grandchildren. I'm collecting them all. But the barrage was really, I think, almost unprecedented. It was extraordinary.
Yeah. Must have been very hard to hold firm.
It was hard to hold firm, and I've thought a lot about it. And in a way, it's a feminist issue, if you don't mind, Julian. I think if it had been a man there in Senate estimates, challenged for 8 hours with no breakfast, no lunch, a man could have been irritable, a bit rude, a little bit discourteous, pushed back, even got a little angry, and got away with it. But I knew instinctively that if I lost my temper, if I was as rude to them as they were to me, if I were immoderate in my response, if I moved away from what I knew about, which was the law and the facts, I would lose my case instantly. I would be seen as an emotional woman who was basically not an appropriate appointment. And it did occur to me that maybe I could either faint or burst into tears, but I decided that I was too old for all of that, and the best thing to do was to carry on regardless. But it was hard. It was very hard. And if I can tell a short story about these things, always affect your family. And I have a wonderful family with a great sense of humour, and a husband who's always ready with a gin and tonic. But on one occasion, my son rang me up, he's a lawyer in Paris. He rang me up and he said, "What have you said this time, Mum?" And I said, "Well, nothing out of the ordinary." And he said, "Well, you should check the Twitter feed. You're out ranking Taylor Swift." And just to annoy my son, I said, "Who's Taylor Swift?"
I was going to ask you the same question.
But I have this vision in my mind of sort of satin-clad Taylor Swift waking up in the morning thinking, who is this extraordinary woman? And I wonder what songs she sings. But there were funny sides, but I'd have to say it was not funny at the time. And I think I'd pick up the Australian at the weekend and there will be a front page of me, then an editorial, then a cartoon, and probably one of the editorial stable putting in their two bob's worth. And I mean, in the end, it became more amusing than serious because it was so over the top and so irrational and blinkered to what I was trying to talk about, which was the condition at that stage of 1,100 children in appalling conditions on Christmas Island and Nauru, Villawood, and of course at Mitre here in Melbourne. And they were heartbreaking circumstances. And Julian, you know this at least as well as I do. When you listen to the story of one family, one child, you can't turn your back on them. You can't say, well, I'll add you to my social science research and report to Parliament and we'll see what happens. You can't do that, and I don't think any one of you in the audience could do that either. They are with us in Australia and we owe protection, but they're human beings, and that comes through loud and clear when you're standing in the heat and the sun, covered in phosphate dust on Christmas Island, talking to these people. You know you're dealing with people who are exactly the same as you, and I deeply believe that the rule of law means that we must treat them with humanity, and the rule of law should have its day. They should have their day with the law.
Well, it's interesting you say that about the obviously the impact on children is dreadful. In fact, as I understand the science, self-harm and suicide is almost unheard of in prepubescent children, except in Australia's detention system. Right. And now, interestingly, the courts seem to be pushing back because there have been a few cases in recent months where children on Nauru, not held in detention, but hiding in the regional processing centre because it's too dangerous for them in the community at large, have been self-harming. Several have made really serious attempts to kill themselves. And when we've brought applications in the federal court to have them brought to Australia where they can be properly treated, Dutton sends lawyers along to oppose that. And in fact, in one case that happened just before Christmas, counsel for the minister said, oh, you shouldn't make an order bringing the child here until there's been a trial of the action. And the judge looked at him and said, well, the problem is she might be dead by then. It's a pretty chilling thought. But that's, you know, that's the courts doing the job which the parliamentarians should be doing. But I was going to say, it's not just children, it's adults as well. I had a very distressing conversation with a doctor who worked with IHMS, who provide the medical services under contract to the government, and she'd been a doctor on Christmas Island. And she made the point that when people arrive on the boats, they've typically been in a very difficult voyage. They've typically come from countries that are landlocked, so they haven't been on the ocean before. They've typically spent 7 or 8 days at sea. They've typically had not enough to eat or drink. They've typically had no opportunity to clean up or change their clothes, and they typically arrive in clothing caked with their own excrement. And she said that they're not allowed to clean up or change before they're interviewed by a member of the immigration department. And then, if they've got any medication, it's taken from them and destroyed. If they've got any medical documentation, it's taken from them and destroyed. If they've got any medical prosthetics, false arms, for example, those are taken and not returned. Anyway, she told me that there was one woman who'd been held in detention on Christmas Island for some weeks. You know, the idea of this initial interview is to see whether there's any reason why they can't be shunted off to offshore processing. And she said there was a woman who'd been there for some weeks because she was thought to be mad, but no one knew the nature of her madness. They didn't know why she was mad, because of course she didn't have any medication or documents or anything like that. So the doctor had a very long consultation with this woman, made more difficult by the fact that the interpreter, who they needed, was in Sydney at the other end of a phone, 4,000 miles away. And the doctor eventually worked out that the problem was the woman was incontinent of urine, and she couldn't leave her cabin without having urine running down her leg, and that was driving her mad. So the doctor said to immigration, we need incontinence pads. Their initial response is, we don't do those. She insisted, and they said, okay, well, she can have 4 per day. Any more would be a fire hazard, apparently. But as soon as the woman had incontinence pads, her demeanour changed dramatically. Now, you've got to wonder what sort of people is it that run a system that does that to individual human beings who've done absolutely nothing illegal, although we call them illegals. What sort of system is it? What sort of people can do that?
Well, I don't really understand that, and it's, you know, your story is an important one, because although one can talk about the bigger legal principles, and even about the law, the Refugee Convention and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Rome Migration Act, it's the spitefulness of it that when you're actually there, it's the little things that upset people, actually.
It's
in
ordinary,
some ways,
decent conduct.
That's right.
Is what you need.
There was one woman that I went to with on Christmas Island into the living quarters to visit, and she had spent 3 days under a blanket. She was retiring. She was cutting off, no eye contact with the children. Her husband was frantic, holding the children. I went into the cabin and talked to her. It was swelteringly hot. It was one of these converted shipping containers. The husband was outside with the children crying. She was not communicating. And I'd taken a medical officer with me. She went out to help with the children. I stayed with this woman, and she had a guard at the open door, a woman on guard reading a book. And the detainee, the woman, started to vomit. And I was trying to clean her up and look after her. And I said to the guard, would you get a doctor to come, because she's vomiting and she can't stop vomiting, and we need some towels and things and to look after her. And she said to me, that's not part of my job, and went back to her novel. And I thought, the spitefulness, one of the things that, I don't know how many in the audience have ever heard of or know where Yonge Hill is. Does anyone know where it is? Well, Yonge Hill is, yes, 1 or 2 people do, you might be West Australians. It's 2 hours outside Perth. There are about 350 men there in a maximum security prison. They are mostly asylum seekers or refugees, or they lost their visas on character grounds at the discretion of the minister. And there's a lot to complain about, and I won't go through all of that, but the thing that they mostly wanted to talk to me about was they couldn't understand how they were ranked as high risk, medium risk, or low risk, and it makes a huge difference to which part of the compound they're in, or whether they get books, or whether they get the various other forms of reasonable treatment. And I spoke to the superintendent of Yongah Hill and said, well, how do you determine these different security rankings, because it affects their lives so intimately, and they've been here for years, and they're likely to be here for many more years. And he said, oh, well, there's an algorithm. And I said, how is the algorithm determined? And he said, oh, well, Canberra just puts the statistics in and we get an answer, and that's how we do it. And there's no personal assessment. And it rules the lives of these people in a remote part of Australia that most Australians have never heard of and have no idea where it is. And all this is happening in our name for people who are absolutely in despair with no hope. And typically, they are separated from their families. Their families might be in Brisbane or in Sydney, but they're over there in Yongah Hill, so the families can't afford to go and see them. So to come back to the point, it's the spitefulness of many of the policies, as well as the enormity of what we're doing. And to go back to your point about the children, we found in our study at the Human Rights Commission that the greatest, in fact, something like 90% of the assaults and sexual assaults took place against the children. And when this figure emerged from our processes, I asked the staff to go back and redo it, because I couldn't believe that the ones who were actually most likely to suffer from reported assaults and sexual assaults were children. I thought we must have got that wrong. And the staff went back and clarified the statistic, and again, the government has never refuted it.
And a lot of those assaults, as I recall it, are assaults by locals who've been taken onto the payroll, like the locals who look after the showers and offer children an extra 1 minute under the shower if they expose themselves and so on.
That's right. So I think that there's the big picture. There's trying to understand treatment of people for the glib slogans that Mr. Abbott is largely responsible for, and that have been cynical and opportunistic, but enormously effective. We've got to hold people and treat people in this way. We've got to have offshore processing, introduced, of course, by a Labor government in '92, but we've got to do it to stop the boats and save the drownings at sea. And very reasonable people stop me in the supermarket and say, Gillian, we're sympathetic with what you're trying to do, we're sympathetic with these families and their children, but we've got to stop the boats, we've got to stop the people smugglers. So the political debate has been a very simplistic one, and very, very hard to break through those slogans, to say this is a false binary. That's not a very snappy phrase. I've got to learn how to do this. But you've got to be able to say we can secure our borders. We can rescue people at sea. We can work with Indonesia and Malaysia and Vietnam and Sri Lanka and the Philippines. We can work with them to provide protection for people, often stateless, Rohingya and others. And at the same time, we can assess proper claims to refugee status. We can treat those who are within our borders in a humane way, consistent with the law. We can do it. But to make that argument is very, very difficult in a 5-second grab on the news.
It's harder than that, because you've got to make the argument to people who are willing to listen to it, and getting through to the people who don't already share your views is very difficult.
Yes, because when do you ever get to talk to them?
Because, well, how do you get them to hear it at all? They're not going to be listening to, Neil Mitchell and people like that probably aren't going to invite you on to give your version
I've never
of
been
things.
invited on it.
And Alan Jones likewise. And actually, there's one exception to that. I was given a free run by John Laws when he was still on air. I had cross-examined him at the Broadcasting Cash for Comment inquiry, and to my surprise, he got very anxious about the fact that Aladdin Sislam, who was left by himself on Manus after everyone from Manus had been hosed over to Nauru. He was very worried that Aladdin Sisalem had been brought to Australia by court order, but Aladdin had had a cat. The cat was his only company, and the cat had been left on Manus when Aladdin was brought over to Australia. And John Laws was very worried about the cat. And so his assistant rang me up and said, look, Mr. Laws wants you to come on the program to talk about Aladdin's cat. And I said, look, that's okay as long as he gives me equal time on the refugee situation generally. And to my astonishment, she rang back and said, yes, that'll be okay. And so he gave me about 12 or 13 minutes talking about the cat, and then, with seamless skill, said, well, now, since I've got you on the phone, what are we doing about asylum seekers generally? And he gave me 12 or 13 minutes free air. It's fantastic. Probably the only time that message has got through to the people who listen to John Laws. Didn't make a difference.
Well, that is I'm sure you must have made some difference. But that is perhaps a very contemporary problem, isn't it? That because we can control the media we are exposed to, we live in a hall of mirrors. We simply, through social media and through the things that we decide we want to be part of, we can control and ensure that we have reflected back to us our own views. And that's made it even more difficult to put a view that's different in the groups that don't agree with you. And that's why I think it's so marvellous to have public discussions like this.
Except that people, I'm assuming that most of the people here already agree with us.
Well, that's
you may
very
be picking
likely.
up a fact or two, but you probably agree with. If there's anyone out there who's on the Alan Jones side of the debate, let us know.
Well, that's the problem, and we now live in this world of post-truth and alternative facts. It's increasingly difficult to try to put a factual, evidence-based position when there's a growing tolerance for falsity or for the alternative fact, as the Americans like to call it. So it has become much more difficult to get the point. And so you find that you do an op-ed or you do a public speech, but you're still not getting to the people that you need to persuade, if you can, with evidence.
Yeah. Well, have you ever been invited to do an op-ed for the Herald Sun?
I don't believe I have.
No, nor have I.
Or they wouldn't publish it if I did one, I'm sure.
It is a fairly serious difficulty, I think. But of course, all of this, a few minutes ago you said that offshore processing started in 92, brought in by Labor. You meant indefinite detention.
I meant indefinite detention, sorry.
Offshore processing, of course, was introduced in 2001 during the Tampa litigation. John Howard ran around and recruited Nauru and Papua New Guinea to take 434 asylum seekers. Can you believe it? And that ultimately failed, but it is an interesting thing that the public at large, because that coincided, the Tampa litigation coincided rather unhappily with another event, because the judgment of Justice North in the Tampa case was handed down at 2:15 in the afternoon, Melbourne time, on the 11th of September 2001. 8 or 9 hours later, the attack on America happened. And all of a sudden, Islamophobia became the new anti-Semitism. And that seems to be a very, very powerful influence. Islamophobic ideas seem to be very powerful now.
Well, there's something called the Islamophobia Register that was established about 3 years ago, and that is now doing what I think the Jewish community have been doing for a very long time, and that is keeping an accurate record of all reported incidents. There are many more incidents than those reported, but it still gives you a bit of a sense of what's happening. And I think the Jewish Council of Deputies has recently reported a 20% increase in anti-Semitic incidents over the last couple of years, and similarly the Islamophobia Register is also registering, I think, something like 256 registered incidents over the last year, and that is rising. And one of the curious features about Islamophobia, of course, is that it's the women who are largely the ones under attack. It's the burqa or the headscarf, the simple headscarf, that is now like a lightning rod for public abuse, and those ones do tend to be reported. But I think you're right, Julian. I think it's always hard to put a sort of an historical line in the sand, but I think 2001 was a pivotal year when you might also remember, I think you pointed out this before, that it was the same year in which Mr. Howard talked up the lie that asylum seekers had thrown their children overboard.
Yes.
And that was demonstrated again by a Senate inquiry, a bit like the Moss report, a Senate inquiry that demonstrated there was absolutely no substance to the allegation whatsoever. But what it did from that time on, I think, we've seen a linkage between unauthorised maritime arrivals, asylum seekers arriving in boats dashing up against rocks, deaths at sea, linkage with those of the Islamic faith, and then an almost immediate linkage with terrorism, 9/11, border security, and fear. And that year has been pivotal. And when we're seeing the consequences of that now with the Islamic community really very, very worried indeed. They're a tiny percentage, I think it's 2.2%. Of religious groups in Australia. It's very small, but
it's worth mentioning
blown
that no person who's arrived in Australia as a boat person has ever been convicted of anything in the range of terrorism offences, and they are all underrepresented in general crime statistics.
That's right.
I mean, it's astounding. They are treated as though they're the worst thing ever.
Yes, I think it's extraordinary. I did see a statistic, and I won't quote it because I'm not actually sure that it's true, but I think, or totally true, but there's a very high, you are something like 40 times less likely to be convicted of a criminal offence as an asylum seeker. It's quite an extraordinary figure. Even if it's half that, it's astonishing.
Yeah.
But one of the things, and that's why I do mention this sort of post-truth phenomenon, the mythology in the community, that even fair-minded people who want to understand it still are influenced by these myths, that asylum seekers are on welfare and don't contribute to the community. Well, even the Business Council of Australia has said, we want migrants, we want people who've been through the process. They're absolutely vital to Australia's gross domestic product. So there's a wonderful level of support there, of course.
The problem, I think, is that the coincidence of 9/11 and the Tampa episode and the political rhetoric around it meant that lying about boat people became politically effective. Calling them illegal, calling the exercise border protection. You get dishonest politicians like Peter Dutton, let him sue me for that. Lying, calling unauthorised maritime arrivals, he calls them illegal maritime arrivals. He's repeatedly said how boat people are illegal. They don't commit any offence. Calling them illegal, calling the exercise of pushing them away border protection is simply dishonest. So what would Australians do? Most Australians, when they hear what we're doing to asylum seekers, are shocked. But they're not allowed to know what we're doing to asylum seekers because, first of all, there's the lies, coupled with the utterly deceptive suggestion that they really have to push the boats back because they're worried about people drowning. That's one of the really grand lies because it sounds respectable. So what do they do to the ones who don't drown? Oh, we'll punish them. That's brilliant. I mean, that shows you where their sentiments really lie. We'll punish you if you don't drown because we're worried that you might. That's odd. What do you do? What do you do to people who are caught in a burning building? You do not hit them on the head if they try to jump out of the window and escape to safety. And yet that's what we do with asylum seekers. Most Australians cannot get to places like Nauru or Manus Island, cannot get access to the detainees. It's incredibly hard nowadays to get into the local detention centres, although they're mostly not boat people in the detention centres now. And most people I speak to are really quite astonished when they learn what we're doing. Because they recognise at some deep level, we're not a country that does that, surely. Like locking up Basic for umpteen years without charge, without trial. There's a bloke on Christmas Island at the moment he's stateless. He was born in West Sahara. He doesn't know exactly where because his parents are dead. He got to Europe. He got caught up with some difficulties and fled Europe on his way to New Zealand. The plane stopped in Australia the immigration authorities here put him in detention, hasn't got an asylum claim. He's been in detention on Christmas Island for 8 years because they can't remove him, they can't give him a visa or won't give him a visa of any sort, and he's a bloke in his mid-20s. Now, most Australians would say, how can you do that to someone? How can you lock someone up who's innocent?
This is a key question, really. And why are fair-minded, decent Australians, most Australians, would never agree to this behaviour if it was happening on their doorstep? How have we allowed this to happen? And one has to go back to the Holocaust. You have to say, how did this happen in Germany in the 30s? Piece by piece, this legislation to permit this regime, and now we have, of course, the Super Ministry of Home Affairs run by Mr Dutton. Piece by piece, this legislation has been passed, and we've been largely either oblivious to it or turned a blind eye to it. I think it's something that's common to all societies, that when it's not directly part of your own life, you can ignore it, especially if it's put in a context of fear that these people threaten our lives, they threaten Australian borders, they jump the queue, they're illegals, that emotive language. That fear has been prompted by our politicians, and it's turned Australians into a people who say, we're just going to turn a blind eye, we won't look at it.
That's the worrying feature about what's going on now, because in Germany, which was and is now a very civilised country, they were told for years, in the late 20s through to the mid-30s, late 30s, they were told for years that Jews were to be feared and hated. And that made it possible to mistreat them in ways that would be regarded now, in Germany especially, would be regarded as utterly unthinkable. And we're doing the same. We are behaving in ways that are unthinkable.
Well, I think we have to be alert to this. I mean, I'm loath to talk about the situation in Germany in the 30s because it's overdone. People reach out to it too often, perhaps, and diminish it in some respects. But I think it's dangerous in our society where we have no Bill of Rights, we're the only democracy and the only common law country in the world without one. We have a government with executive powers that are unprecedented, that the Australian public knows almost nothing about. These laws are being introduced and passed regularly, including, you might be familiar with the new foreign interference laws and charity laws that are being considered in Parliament. It's complicated law, people don't really understand it. It's put in highly emotive terms that we want to stop, as the Prime Minister said, we want to stop Chinese influence in Australia. I mean, a disgraceful thing for a leader to have said in any event, but putting that to one side, that's an example of the way in which our democracy is actually being chipped away by these laws that expand the government powers and that are outside the realm of judicial control. And Julian and I agree with you, Julian, that the courts have done a good job in some respects protecting human rights, and they have done in some cases, but in most they've been quite powerless because the language of the Migration Act is so crystal clear that judges, because of this deep fear in Australia of an activist judge, will abide by the strict language of the Migration Act. And in one case that I mentioned very briefly, if I may, the M68 case, a Bangladeshi woman who, again, her claim to refugee status had not been assessed, but she was held on Nauru for many, many months, was pregnant and was allowed to have a baby in Brisbane. She then sought an injunction to prevent being returned to Nauru with her pro bono litigation lawyers. And she challenged the Migration Act and said the Migration Act didn't allow the officials to deport her back to Nauru. And when the government officials and the lawyers looked at this, at the Migration Act, they said, well, actually, it doesn't allow deportation. So what do? Somebody in the public service, hopefully not a student of mine, goes and drafts another piece of legislation which fills the gap in the Migration Act retrospectively to cover the period of time that affected that Bangladeshi woman. Now, when that legislation, as amended, finally got to the High Court, the majority of the High Court said, well, initially and before the amendment, the government had no legislative power to deport this woman back to Nauru. But because of the retrospective legislation, it cured the defect, and we're now allowed to deporter. Only one judge on the High Court resisted that, and that was Justice Gordon.
Yep.
And she courageously, in my very respectful view, said, the conditions on Nauru are of a kind that constitute a penalty. And as you may know, only courts can impose penalties. The executive government cannot. This is the principle of the separation of judicial powers. Now, I know that this language is for lawyers, but one of my concerns is that one of the reasons we've been unwilling to speak up and step up about these conditions and treatment of asylum seekers is that Australians are not well educated about their constitution. When you talk about the separation of judicial powers, the fact that only courts can impose penalties, the executive cannot, this is a crystal clear principle of our democratic system. And yet I think most Australians barely understand that it's there. And a survey was done a few years ago in which the Electoral Commission asked Australians, do we have a constitution? And 48% of Australians said no. They then asked the next question, do we have a Bill of Rights? And something like 68% of people said yes.
Yes, and some of them supported that by saying, because we can always take the fifth. Which
That's quite right.
Yeah.
So we know more about our legal rights from American television programs than we do for our own education system. So I am deeply worried about this, that this problem of turning a blind eye, of legislation being passed in Canberra, sophisticated stuff, complex, nobody gets across it, so it's polarised with slogans to say we'll keep the foreigners out or we'll stop charities abusing the system or whatever slogan they want to use, and it all passes us by until one day it's on our doorstep. And when a member of our family or we are affected by a breach of our human rights. And often that's discrimination in the employment area, delivery of goods and services. The major issue, of course, and one that we've finally resolved, was marriage equality, the right of equality before the law. It's in the Victorian Charter. We don't have it at the federal level. It's very complex, but I think it's deeply troubling. I think the asylum seeker treatment is a symptom of something much more dangerous, and it shows up in the rejection of the Uluru Statement and the failure to acknowledge the Indigenous rights to land. It's reflected in the fact that we now have more Aboriginal people in detention, 10 times more than we had at the time of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. We've had something like 330 Aboriginal deaths in custody, exacerbated by laws in the Northern Territory, for example, the paperless arrest laws, where you can arrest people without any paperwork to save the police the paperwork. And Indigenous Australians are now being held in unprecedented numbers. Aboriginal children 10 times more likely to be taken into out-of-home care. Extraordinary rates of domestic violence. Approximately a woman every week is killed by her partner or former partner. Juvenile detention facilities, juvenile crime rates, the failure to invest in our communities. So what I'm saying is the asylum seeker failure by Australia is actually mirrored in many, many other aspects of Australian life, but it's one that the Australian public hasn't really understood it. We see pockets of it, but we don't see the whole.
So I think one of the problems is in Australia, most people's human rights are not at risk. But people at the margins, they're the ones whose human rights are at risk, but they're usually unpopular or totally powerless.
That's
and
right.
they, so if their human rights are knocked out, no one cares.
That's absolutely true, Julian. It is the vulnerable, the homeless, the impoverished, the mentally ill who are most vulnerable, in addition, obviously, to asylum seekers being a slightly different category. But I should say that at the Australian Human Rights Commission, every year at the federal level, and this is replicated in the Human Rights Commissions in every state and territory, but at the federal level, we would receive about 20,000 inquiries and complaints a year. They're ordinary Australians ringing the Commission or emailing the Commission with essentially a human rights complaint. But most of those are not any of the issues we've been talking about. They're almost always employment discrimination or discrimination in the delivery of goods and services. So it's age discrimination. The majority of complaints are by people with disabilities. It's extraordinary. They can't get access to theatres, they can't get jobs, they can't get sustainable positions, they can't get proper housing. These are issues that I think perhaps if we understood those issues a little bit better, it might provide a platform for then understanding some of the other issues that are more distant, remote, Indigenous, homeless, violence and so on.
And now we're being prompted to move to question and answers in a moment, but before we do, one of the difficulties with all of this, of course, is that I mean, the Human Rights Commission is terrific because people can go there. They don't need lawyers. Lawyers are a nuisance. But if they want to try and redress their rights in other forums, they probably do need a lawyer. And most people can't afford lawyers. And the government is gradually defunding legal aid. And they threatened last year, was it, to reduce the funding of community legal centres.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Now, I did some calculations when they were about to reduce the funding of community legal centres. With the funding that the community legal centres received before any cuts, and given the number of people they saw, it was working out at less than $300 per consultation. Now, try and get that from a lawyer. You know, I mean, it's just dazzling. And yet, the same government that wants to hide from us the nasty things it's doing is making it harder and harder for people whose rights are trashed to get any sort of remedy at all. And that's something
right.
we should all be worried about it. You know, remember Martin Niemöller. When they came for the socialists, I said nothing because I'm not a socialist. When they came for the trade unionists, I said nothing because I'm not a trade unionist. When they came for the Jews, I said nothing because I'm not a Jew. And when they came for me, there was no one to speak for me. We all need to bear that in mind. It's very hard to do it, but well, you and I probably find it a bit easier to think of ourselves being hurled into the darkness, but all of us should bear that in mind, I think. Anyway, I think John is going to, yes, he's going to interrupt us. And say that other thing about the Indigenous people.
You're very graciously. So I'm sure there are lots of questions in the room. We have just under half an hour for you to ask them of these two nuisances who are going to stay with us for a bit longer. So yes, just raise your hand.
We're un-Australian. Remember? Peter Dutton told us that.
Yes, lawyers are un-Australian.
Just raise your hand and a microphone will come to you. So please wait until you have a microphone. And I will gradually get around as many people as I can. Okay.
Hi, thanks for that. That was really great to listen to. I was just wondering how you think that the lack of diversity in our parliament affects all these issues. We seem to have a very senior group leading us at the moment, and lack of diversity in culture, language, gender, and if we sort of had more youth maybe generated in our leaders, how this might change issues regarding human rights, as you know, it's much more of a relevant issue.
Well, can I say, from my experience, the people who are the most active and the most effective in this area have been people who are not only young, but also female. Young women have been incredibly powerful, way beyond their numbers. So bring it on.
Yes. Oh, it is interesting, actually. Young women really do get this. I think, of course, diversity is across the entire community. It's extraordinary how we are led by older, white men. Wonderful though some of them are. I think we are our corporate world, banking world, and certainly governance does not reflect the society that we are. And one of the things I've loved about my job is I've been able to work across Australia, all over the country, in rural areas, all over all the major cities, provincial towns, and country communities. And that's when you realise just what an extraordinary country we are, of such fascinating diversity and languages and cultures, but we have not really learned to embrace it. And if none of those arguments affect you, look at the economic ones. When women and people of different religions and cultures and races are on boards, the share price goes up within a couple of years. It's just astonishing. There's much greater originality, much greater creativeness, new ideas, confidence, competence, and good governance with diversity, and I think we desperately need it at the federal level. It's been a struggle. It's disgraceful where we are now. I think on the World Economic Forum's Global Index, women now are 75th in the world for political engagement at senior levels. It's just extraordinary where we are, except we're number 1 in the world for education. So something has gone very, very badly wrong in Australia over particularly the last 20 years. So diversity, yes, covering a lot of aspects of our contemporary life.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks. Providentially, a letter came from Mr. Dutton 2 days ago, and I thought I must bring it tonight. It was written by me and Bishop Philip Huggins on behalf of Befriend a Child in Detention, one of the many groups that is trying to help the children on Nauru. And we had written to Mr. Dutton back in February. It's taken quite a while for the response, but he does apologise for the length. We had written to inquire as to why the official statistics that you can find on Immigration Department websites about the number of children on Nauru, the latest that we could find was February, said that there were 30. And we knew that there were at least 150. There seemed such a discrepancy, we thought we should ask the Minister. And he has responded. And there are just 2 lines I would like to read to you from his letter, which will bring you much comfort. But I have to put my glasses on. Oops. Thank you. First of all, in one of his paragraphs, he says, as a party to the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, the Refugee Convention, in case we didn't know, and its 1967 protocol, Australia takes its international obligations seriously. Australia is committed to providing protection to refugees consistent with the obligations set out in the Refugee Convention and other relevant international treaties to which Australia is a party. Well, you may not have known that, but that's what he says. And then he comes...
Could you come to the... Sorry.
A little later to the figure. No, there's only one more sentence, okay. I promise. From a peak of 1,992 children in held detention on the 31st of July 2013, the number of children in held detention was reduced to 0 on the 1st of April 2016. It was reduced to 0.
Because they weren't in detention because Nauru has a constitutional Bill of Rights.
But we've still been sending them gifts. It's strange, isn't it?
Well, this is where I think, to put it very gently, this is deeply misleading of the Australian public. It's frankly a lie. The secrecy surrounds all of this. It's very difficult to get accurate figures, but I believe that you're right at about 140 children on Nauru. But they make a distinction between those that are in held detention, that is within a designated detention centre, and those that might now be in the local community, effectively detained on an island. In international law, that is detention, but that's not how... You see, this government, it's a bit like Alice in Wonderland, the caterpillar, as was it, the words mean what I want them to mean, and that's really, it's 1984 all over again. The truth is what the leader describes as the truth. It's very worrying, and that letter really is an extremely good example of it, so thank you very much.
I want to add a little observation. For all of you who are inclined to write a letter to a politician, write to your local member of whichever major party and that person's opposite number, but write a brief letter. A classic will be something like, Dear so-and-so, I'm a voter in your electorate. Do you think boat people are, quote-unquote, illegal? If yes, what offence do they commit? Yours faithfully. The shorter it is, the more difficult it is for them to escape answering it.
That's a good bit of barrister's advice. Can I say that one of the things also that's so powerful is film, and some of you may be aware there's a Human Rights Film Festival just launching tonight, in fact, with a marvellous film, I think, An Apology, or Saying Sorry Means You Won't Do It Again, where I think it's the opening film, but there's another one, a marvellous one coming up called Borderland,
Border politics.
Politics, I'm sorry, that has been produced and it covers all of these issues, but in graphic, cinematographic form, and it's very powerful, and it explodes these myths, but of course it's global. It's not just Australia, but it's very interesting how isolated Australia is from the international standards of so many other countries on these questions, and that again is a matter of concern for our democracy.
And I agree with that, and I should say I'm the unscripted sort of David Attenborough character in it, and Gillian is one of the people I speak to in the course of the film. So.
Hi. So there's a lot of legislation, like you said, coming through Canberra that is obviously quite questionable, and yet it's being passed. One particular amount of amendments, I guess, came through the Foreign Fighters Bill, which is now legislation, and looking at the ASIO powers. So my question to you is whether, which human right is obviously the most impacted upon with that, and is there a constitutional breach? Also, does our state practice breach international human rights laws?
Are you asking with particular reference to the Foreign Fighters Bill?
Yes.
Act?
And
yeah.
the ASIO, the detention powers, and the meaning as well behind all the definitions and the powers, the extensive powers that they now have that they can do with the executive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Look, you've asked an enormous number of questions there, and then they're important. They're very important because these just slip by. But my own view is that, firstly, we are almost invariably in breach of our international obligations. And can I just take a moment to say, this is the year we're celebrating the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Some of you in the room might recall this remarkable man, Doc Evatt, who helped draft it and was President of the General Assembly when it was passed without a single negative vote in 1948. The Universal Declaration has formed the basis for all of the human rights treaties that Australia played such a strong role in negotiating, ratifying, but we haven't given effect to them in domestic law. That is why you get this huge diversity. Our international obligations over there, which we are ignoring, and I think the simple answer, if there is one, to what you've said is, yes, we are in breach of our international obligations. The Foreign Fighters Bill breaches freedom of movement, all sorts of principles of the rights in relation to citizens that are our citizens who might be fighting in that bill. But it means that in the domestic law context, we do not have the protections in our domestic law that we should have. And that is why we have this it's like ships passing in the night. The international law that our forebears developed in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, right up to the International Criminal Court in the 90s. And then it stopped, as Julian has said, with the children overboard. Can I point out, though, that there are now submissions to the International Criminal Court to bring government officials, including Mr. Dutton, before the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. Now, I don't know where that's going to go, but it gives you some idea, or draws us into the international community. We cannot turn our backs on the community that we were once so strongly a part of. We're now back in the Human Rights Council, and that's a good thing. I hope that will at least open our eyes a little. But it's a terrific question, it's a complicated one.
There's a footnote to that, by the way, since I'm the author of one of the communiques to the ICC. When we signed up to belong to the International Criminal Court, a condition of it is that you have to introduce in your own domestic law charges that are equivalent to the offences of the Statute of Rome over which the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction. We did that in October of 2002. So before October 2002, if you committed genocide, that wasn't an offence. After October 2002, it was. And so in that part of the Commonwealth Criminal Code, there are all these offences that mirror the Statute of Rome. But prosecution for breach of those provisions can only be brought with the approval of the Attorney General. And generally speaking, the Attorney General seems reluctant to prosecute members of his own party.
Yes, highly unlikely.
Thank you. There was someone in the middle there who's been waiting for a while.
Hi, Gillian and Julian, thank you so much. Preliminary statement, I have in good faith been trying to make the best list that I can, but aside from writing a brief, sharp letter to our local member and his or her shadow, what can Joe or Jill, audience member, do to defend and extend human rights? What can we do tomorrow?
It's a really good question.
Well, it's the important
Maybe
question.
advocating for a Charter of Human Rights at federal level, because I think most Australians do have a sense of what is decent conduct and what's not, and we are behaving indecently because we have laws that permit it. But if you had protection of human rights at that level, by reference to general propositions like we see in the Universal Declaration, then those laws would be seen for what they are, a real betrayal of our character as a nation, I think.
I think speaking up. Each of you lives in your own environment as professionals, as teachers, public servants. Speak up about this. Get your facts right. That's important, because if you get it wrong, people can dismiss you terribly quickly. Get your facts right and speak up and use whatever forum you've got. If it's your local gardening newsletter, get it in there. Julian and I did something recently up at Wodonga for Rural Australians for Refugees. Wonderful women. I'm a patron of Older Women for Refugees and Rural Australians for Refugees, do things with the knitting nanas, grandmothers who support asylum seeker children. I think we've been lulled into a passivity, which is not the Australian mythology about ourselves. We like to see ourselves as being, out there and idiosyncratic and individual and anti-authoritarian. I think that's mythology. I think the reality is we've become very passive, and if it doesn't affect us, we don't deal with it. And I'm really saying now to everybody who asks that very important question, speak up. Say what you can in the sphere that you can. And I think now, speak up for a Charter of Rights. Say it's time that we had some legislative protection against abuse of government power in Canberra that's being favoured, of course, by both major parties. This is not a party political point. It's a point that's happening across the spectrum.
No, I agree with that, and I'd just add one thing. Not everyone is able to speak up about a Bill of Rights or about the treatment of asylum seekers, for example. But there are lots and lots of breaches of human rights that exist in our community. See if you can help the people who are suffering from those abuses of human rights. To do something. Give expression to the decency which I think informs most Australians. And it doesn't matter who you're helping. Helping one person at a time makes a big difference.
I agree with that.
There's a great story about, I'm sure this has probably got an origin in most countries, of a big beach where every now and then, depending on the state of the tide and the wind, at high tide, lots of starfish get washed up onto the beach. As the tide recedes, they're left there, and if they stay in the sun for too long, they die. A little girl who lives in a town nearby is very distressed by this, goes down to the beach, and a grown-up says to her very sensibly, "You can't save them all." So her response is to bend down, pick one up, throw it into the ocean and said, "Well, I've saved that one." If we all do that, if we all try and save one person, we're making an enormous difference to human rights in this country.
Thank you. At the back there.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. My question is, as climate change gets worse, and as we will see that throughout our lifetime, what do you think the impact will be both on politics and on human rights?
So, could you repeat that last part?
Sure. What do you think the impact of climate change will be on politics and human rights?
Small question.
Not good.
Well, it's already had a huge impact on politics, as we know. I think we have to be very conscious of the fact that many human beings, our lives will be directly affected by climate change and are being affected by climate change. And I tend to see them as integrated ideas, that human beings have a right to a healthy environment. But equally, we should work empathetically with the environment. We're intertwined. We depend on the environment. The environment has to manage with us. I think we just need to understand that there's an opposite and equal action for every one of our actions, and we must in the global sense, understand that as sea rises increase, as the ocean becomes acidic, as our forests are dying and species are becoming extinct, people are moving across vulnerable areas in the Mekong Delta and certainly in the smaller Pacific islands. Disease will spread in different ways across the African continent. I think we've got to speak up for these issues. They're fundamentally important, and they're important to human rights, but humans have a responsibility to the environment, and I think they're intertwined.
Just there.
The talk of climate change just brought to mind the anti-scientific, the attack on science, the attack on experts. So, for example, you are experts in law, where that whole belief in education and experience and being an expert in a field is being undermined. It almost chips away the base of our whole society. I mean, I guess you could also include Parliament, you know, lack of faith in Parliament and government institutions. How do we tackle that sort of massive problem?
On climate change, you're right, there has been an attack on climate change or climate scientists. There's a good response to it. And that is, if you meet a climate change denier, you say to them, okay, what percentage of climate scientists believe it's real and anthropogenic and dangerous and so on? And if they know their facts, they'll tell you it's in the high 90%. And they would say that scientific truth isn't proved by majority vote, and that's true. So you say, okay, well, let's give it 80% odds against the climate scientists. Let's say 80% says they're wrong, but 20% says that, you know, it could be really bad and we could do something to stop it. 20% chance of an avoidable catastrophic result is worse odds than Russian roulette. So tell them to go and play Russian roulette with their grandchildren. They will not have an answer to that, by the way.
Well, I think, yes, that's true. One of my disappointments is that education hasn't been the key. When I was at the law school here up the road at the University of Melbourne in the early 60s, and privileged to have a completely free education, I might add, on a Commonwealth scholarship, which a lot of people got them in those days. I wasn't particularly special. But I remember thinking then that this was the age to be a woman. We had an opportunity for education on an equal basis. The doors were opening. With education, women could do anything. And that's why I mentioned that statistic earlier tonight, that we're number one in the world for the World Economic Forum for women in education. And yet we're so far down, we're ranked all over 46th in the world for gender equality. The lesson I seem to be having to face is that education is not always the answer. There are power structures, there's systems, there's regimes, there's culture that pushes against science, expert evidence, rationality, and ordered thinking. And I think that is a great challenge for today in this environment where we have, according to the researchers, a growing tolerance for subjective ideological positions. And it's very, very worrying indeed. And as Julian has pointed out, the evidence for human-induced climate change is pretty overwhelming. Why are we not accepting that and acting in accordance with it? So we've got to look to other reasons, which is really behind your question. I think we need leadership, we need cultural change, systemic changes. We have to completely rethink the way in which we go about our lives. But we must come back to the 60s world that I grew up in, where we respected facts, and we respected evidence, and we respected experts. And that's been a completely unpredictable and unexpected a consequence of the last few decades, particularly the last 20 years.
So there's another letter you could write to your local parliamentarian in the post-Trump world. Do you believe truth matters? Yours faithfully.
Well, there's a book by a marvellous woman, a dean of the School of Management at Harvard, and she has written a book called Do Facts Matter? And she did the survey for the year before Trump was elected, and she made the definitive finding that facts do not matter once you have a subjective view and you've made up your subjective mind consistent with your ideology, the facts are irrelevant. Now, with that as a fact, what are we going to do about it? All I can think of is to push back with more facts and more education and try to get the depth of the problem understood.
Now we're down to our last two questions in view of the time, so one there and then one at the back, maybe three. If they're quick.
We've talked a lot about truth today and truth tellers. My question is about Julian Assange. He's an Australian, if we remember, and he has been on indefinite detention as well for a long, long time. Do you have anything to say about that?
I've visited him in the Ecuadorian embassy, and it's a very lovely place, but it was terrible that he's been there so long. The problem is, in Britain, he is very unpopular because he jumped bail by going into the Ecuadorian embassy, and they will lock him up if he steps out the front door. Now, our government, in my opinion, our government should be taking active steps on his behalf to arrange that he can be removed from the Ecuadorian embassy and be brought safely to Australia. But as far as I'm aware, our government is doing nothing of the sort. So yes, we need to be worried about him. He's a person who's, I wouldn't say it's indefinite detention because he went there by choice and he stays there by choice because the alternative is so dangerous for him.
Yes, I mean, the unpopularity is a very negative factor for him in Britain. I mean, with the benefit of hindsight, if he'd gone to Sweden and faced the charges, he probably, well, there's a chance he would have had proper justice, at least proper justice.
The problem with
but
that was he wasn't going to Sweden because Sweden has a witness exchange arrangement with America.
That's right.
This was when Bradley Manning, as he was then, was on trial. He'd been held in terrible conditions for about a year before being brought to trial, and the government of America wanted to get Assange over there so they could try him alongside
Well, that
Manning.
was the problem. If he'd gone to Sweden, he would have been extradited to the United States, and he would have been in an orange jumpsuit and chains in minutes. And so I fully understand why he did it as a strategy. But I do agree that the Australian government, in this case and in others, has been disgraceful in our failure to represent an Australian citizen and to argue the case for him. He has been a truth teller, but he is unpopular in America, in the United States, and parts of Scandinavia as well. So he's got a hard battle to fight. But I think that we should try to keep our mind on what it was he did, and perhaps accept that by getting the truth and the facts out, there was some justification for his behaviour.
He did exactly what other organs of the press did. And what he was saying, what he was revealing, wouldn't have been known to anyone if it hadn't been repeated by the Murdoch press and others, and they're not being hounded.
We are almost out of time, so time for one more question, but it's possible that Julian and Julian might be able to have a quick discussion with people afterwards. But last question, please.
What is your response to technology, specifically the internet, becoming a platform for human rights abuses such as racism?
Well, it's a new relatively new technology. It's been remarkable in terms of access to information and to the exercise of freedom of speech. This is not a subject that we've touched on this evening, but it's obviously one that I spend a great deal of my time on, particularly on 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act. Yes, the internet and social media is a vehicle for profound racism, and it makes the point that freedom of speech is a right, but that right can be abused, and it is abused. And let me perhaps give you a very quick example, if I may. A few years ago, we at the Human Rights Commission had a Racism It Stops With Me social program that the AFL was going to launch kindly for us at an Indigenous game or Indigenous Week game, the Swans Collingwood match. I'm a Collingwood supporter. Not doing very well at the moment, but I did watch the match. And who was playing but Adam Goods, and he was abused racially by a young girl. Unfortunate, sad circumstances, but that's another story. But the key point was that we had the video and the program open in a chat room at the Human Rights Commission for discussion about the Racism It Stops With Me program. That, of course, exploded with the Adam Goodes incident and, of course, the Eddie Maguire casual racism the following Monday morning in an appalling... It made the whole situation far worse. The point of my story is that this open chat room for discussion about racism by Monday morning had turned into one of the most vicious anti-Semitic attacks. It had nothing whatever to do with Adam Goodes or indigeneity. It started there, and it moved, but within 24 hours it had moved into anti-Semitism. And I closed the site down because it was out of control. I was then accused by the Murdoch press of having breached the rights to freedom of speech. So we're in a bad place on this discussion at the moment. My view, and it's not one that everybody shares, and I accept that it's a balance and reasonable minds can differ about it, but my own view is that we have every right to stop people abusing others in the public arena because of their race or national ethnic origin. And despite 2 prime ministers and 1 attorney doing everything they could for 3 or 4 years to amend or change that law, it is now intact and it continues to underpin our multicultural society. So thank you for your question. I think it's an important one.
I want to deal with one very limited slice of the question, and that is the phenomenon of trolls on the internet, Twitter specifically. I'm not convinced, I mean, I get my fair share of abuse from trolls, but I'm not convinced that it's much more painful than when bad-mouthing and gossip happened in the local club, or whatever it was, in the local community. It just reaches more people. Whether that matters to you as an individual is an open question, but I think the benefits we get from the internet probably outweigh the disadvantages.
So look, sadly, we're slightly over time now, but could I ask you to thank most warmly our 2 discussants this evening, who I think have been absolutely brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Julia. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.